Right before he collapsed, the German Shepherd said a word that shattered everything we thought we knew about loyalty. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The rain didn't just fall, it punished the earth, a relentless deluge that turned the Colorado night into a gray, suffocating veil. Maya Rowe fumbled with her keys, her fingers numb after a 14-hour shift at the Mountain View shelter. The facility was quiet, save for the rhythmic drumming on the corrugated roof, until a sound cut through the static of the storm, a deep, guttural rasp that didn't belong to any dog she knew. She swung her flashlight toward the perimeter fence. The beam sliced through the downpour, landing on a mountain of wet fur. A German Shepherd, easily 120 pounds, was swaying against the chain link. He looked less like a pet and more like a casualty of war. A tattered tactical vest clung to his ribs and jagged, silver scars traced a map of pain across his throat. "Hey there, big guy," Maya whispered, her heart hammering. She expected a snarl, a flash of defensive teeth. Instead, the dog locked eyes with her. His amber gaze held a terrifying, human-like clarity. As Maya knelt in the mud, the dog's jaw moved with agonizing effort. A sound emerged, not a bark but a fractured, breathless syllable that froze the blood in her veins. "Please." The word was distorted, scraping out like rusted metal, but it was unmistakable. Maya froze, the flashlight trembling in her hand. Dogs didn't talk. They didn't beg in English. But as the massive animal's legs gave out and he slumped into the dirt, he whispered it one more time. Maya didn't know then that she was holding a classified secret, or that powerful men were already moving through the dark to reclaim him. She only knew that the rules of the world had just broken, and she was the only one left to pick up the pieces. The rain in Colorado Springs didn't fall so much as it attacked, a cold, driving deluge that turned the gravel parking lot of the Mountain View Animal Shelter into a slurry of mud and broken reflections. Maya Rowe leaned into the wind, the collar of her waterproof jacket turned up against the stinging spray. It was nearly midnight. Her back ached with the dull throb of a 14-hour shift, and her mind was a blur of intake forms, dwindling medication supplies, and the faces of the 3 dogs she'd had to turn away that afternoon for lack of space. She turned the heavy iron key in the gate lock, the metal freezing against her numb fingers. She was ready for a silent drive home and a dreamless sleep, but as the tumblers clicked into place, the night changed. A sound rose above the roar of the downpour, a heavy, wet thud followed by a vocalization that made the hair on Maya's arms stand up. It wasn't the sharp yap of a coyote or the deep, territorial bay of a local hound. It was a rhythmic, struggling rasp, like a bellows being pumped by a dying man. Maya gripped her industrial flashlight, her thumb sliding the switch forward. The beam cut a jagged hole through the darkness, sweeping across the chain-link perimeter until it snagged on something impossible. A German Shepherd was slumped against the fence, but he was unlike any specimen Maya had seen in 15 years of rescue work. He was gargantuan, a black and tan titan that looked as though he'd been carved from shadow and muscle, easily pushing 120 pounds. He wasn't standing. He was clinging to the wire mesh, his massive paws hooked into the links as if the fence was the only thing keeping him upright. "Hey," Maya called out, her voice thin against the wind. "Easy, big guy. Easy." She moved closer, her boots splashing through deep puddles. As the light stabilized, the horror of the animal's condition came into focus. He was wearing a tactical vest, the high-grade ballistic nylon shredded as if by shrapnel or teeth. Through the matted, mud-slicked fur on his flanks, Maya could see the dark ink of alphanumeric tattoos, PS07, stamped into his skin with clinical precision. But it was his neck that made her breath hitch. Beneath his jaw, the fur had been shaved away to reveal a web of thick, raised surgical scars that looked far too intentional to be the result of a fight. The dog's head rolled back, his amber eyes catching the light. Most traumatized dogs either snarl or cower, but this one did neither. He looked at Maya with an expression of profound, weary intelligence. He watched her approach not as an animal watches a predator, but as a soldier watches a medic. "You're okay," Maya whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. "I've got you, soldier." "Who did this to you?" The dog's throat worked. The scarred skin shifted, and his chest heaved with a violent, coordinated effort. His jaw didn't snap. It moved with a deliberate, haunting mimicry of human speech. "Please." The sound was a dry, agonizing croak. It was the sound of vocal cords forced into a shape they weren't meant to hold, a word born from a throat that had been surgically altered to betray the laws of nature. Maya stumbled back, her heel catching in the mud. "No," she breathed, her heart slamming against her ribs. "I'm tired. I'm hearing things." She stared at the dog, waiting for a whine or a growl to correct her fractured reality. The shepherd's front legs buckled, and he slid down the fence, his heavy body hitting the mud with a sickening squelch. With the last of his strength, he lifted his head, locking his gaze onto hers with a desperate, pleading intensity. "Please," he rasped again. It was clearer this time, a broken two-syllable plea that carried the weight of 1,000 untold nightmares. The impossibility of it crashed over Maya, drowning out her fear. This wasn't a hallucination. This was a cry for help from a creature that shouldn't have been able to ask. Ignoring every safety protocol she had ever written for the shelter, Maya lunged forward. She threw her arms around the dog's massive, sodden neck, bracing her shoulder against his chest to keep him from sinking further into the mire. He was burning up with fever, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. As she struggled to shift his weight toward the shelter's intake door, her hand brushed against a heavy metal tag dangling from a hidden reinforced collar beneath his vest. She tilted her flashlight down, the beam illuminating the cold steel. There was no name. There was no owner's phone number. There was only a stark, engraved warning that sent a fresh chill down her spine, far colder than the Colorado rain. Property of U.S. government. Canine unit, classified. Do not attempt medical intervention. Call emergency line immediately. Maya looked from the tag to the dog's pleading eyes, realizing with a jolt of terror that the please he had whispered wasn't just a request for life. It was a warning of what was coming for him. Under the flickering security light of the loading dock, she noticed something she had missed. A small, pulsing red light buried deep beneath the skin of the dog's shoulder, blinking in a steady, rhythmic pattern that told her they weren't alone in the dark anymore. The fluorescent lights of the shelter's medical suite hummed with a sterile, unforgiving buzz that felt like a needle against Maya's frayed nerves. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the building, but inside, the air was thick with the copper scent of blood and the smell of wet, singed fur. Dr. Marcus Chin, the shelter's on-call veterinarian, moved with a frantic precision, his brow furrowed behind his glasses as he worked to stabilize the Titan on the steel table. The German shepherd, whom Maya had begun to think of as Kaiser, lay limp, his chest rising in the shallow, erratic hitches of the dying. "I need the high-output scanner, Maya. Now." Marcus barked, not looking up from the dog's throat. Maya scrambled to the cabinet, her hands still stained with the mud from the parking lot. She handed him the device, her eyes never leaving the dog's neck. Now that Kaiser was under the harsh clinical lights, the scars she had seen outside revealed a far more sinister truth. Marcus began to clip the fur away, his surgical shears whispering against the thick coat. As the hair fell away, Maya felt a wave of nausea. The scars weren't from a fight or an accident. They were surgical tracks, precise, recessed channels where the skin had been opened and closed multiple times. Marcus ran a gloved finger along the dog's larynx. "Look at this," he whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of professional fascination and pure horror. "The cartilage has been reinforced with a synthetic mesh. It's a complete reconstruction of the vocal housing. Maya, this isn't just repair work. Someone re-engineered his throat to manipulate airflow. It's a biological instrument." As Marcus moved the scanner down the dog's spine, the machine began to emit a frantic, high-pitched chirp. The digital display flickered with a series of red dots tracing a path from the base of Kaiser's skull down to his lumbar vertebrae. "He's riddled with them," Marcus muttered, his face pale. "Neural implants. These aren't standard ID chips. They're wired directly into the central nervous system. Look at the inflammation around the interface sites." He turned Kaiser slightly, revealing a patch of skin on his flank that was devoid of fur, replaced by a smooth, shiny texture. "Chemical burns. Old ones. And these rib fractures. They've healed, but the alignment is off. This dog hasn't just been trained. He's been broken and rebuilt over and over again. This is resistance training, taken to a psychopathic level." Maya reached out, her fingers hovering just above Kaiser's paw. The dog's pads were worn down to the quick, suggesting he had run for miles across abrasive terrain. He was emaciated, his hip bones protruding like jagged rocks beneath a receding tide. He had likely been starving for weeks, surviving on nothing but adrenaline and whatever twisted purpose had been programmed into his brain. Suddenly, Kaiser's eyes snapped open. They were bloodshot and unfocused, darting around the room until they landed on Marcus, who was holding a needle. The dog didn't growl. Instead, his chest heaved, a wet, clicking sound echoing from the synthetic mesh in his throat. Wait, Maya whispered, stepping closer. Kaiser, it's okay. The dog's jaw unhinged, moving with that same eerie mechanical deliberation she had witnessed in the rain. Marcus froze, the syringe halfway to the dog's foreline. Please, the dog rasped. The word was a jagged shard of sound, clearer now that the wind wasn't swallowing it. Please, stop. Marcus dropped the syringe. It clattered against the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. He looked at Maya, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide with a primal sort of fear. Did he just speak? He said it outside too, Maya said, her voice trembling. He's asking for help, Marcus. This isn't natural, Marcus breathed, leaning in to stare at the dog's moving throat. This is a violation of every law of biology. Someone spent millions of dollars to turn a sentient animal into a mouthpiece. Maya, look at the tattoo again. He pointed to the PS-07 on the dog's ear. Project Sentinel. Subject 7. This isn't a dog. To whoever made him, he's a prototype. An asset. Marcus grabbed a standard military-grade chip reader from the tray and ran it over the shoulder where Maya had seen the pulsing light. The screen didn't show a name or a history. Instead, a string of encrypted hex code scrolled across the display, followed by a single flashing prompt. Access denied. Encryption level, top secret. Biometric override required. We're in over our heads, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. If the government or some private contractor finds out he's here, they won't just take him back. They'll erase the evidence. Including us. Maya looked at Kaiser, who had drifted back into a fitful, pained unconsciousness. She thought of the classified tag and the way he had used his last ounce of strength to beg for mercy in a language that wasn't his own. A cold, hard resolve began to settle in her chest, replacing the fear. I don't care who owns him, Maya said, her voice steadying. He's a living being and he's terrified. We aren't calling that emergency line. Marcus looked at her as if she were insane. Maya, we can't hide a 120-pound talking German shepherd in a public shelter. The scanner is already pinging a location signal. It's only a matter of time. Before Maya could respond, the shelter's front gate alarm began to howl, a piercing shriek that cut through the sound of the rain. She ran to the monitor in the hallway, her heart sinking as she saw two black SUVs idling at the entrance, their headlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of a predator. Two men in tactical gear were already stepping out, and as one of them looked directly into the security camera, he held up a device that sent a burst of static across the screen, turning the feed to a wall of white noise. The dawn didn't bring light so much as a cold, bruised gray that seeped through the shelter's windows. Maya hadn't slept. She sat in the medical bay, her hand resting on the metal edge of Kaiser's table, watching the rhythmic dip of his flank. Marcus had managed to dampen the dog's fever, but the air in the room felt heavy, charged with the ozone scent of an approaching storm that had nothing to do with the weather. At exactly 8 o'clock, a heavy rapping sounded at the front glass. It wasn't the tentative knock of a volunteer. It was the sharp, percussive strike of authority. Maya smoothed her dirt-stained scrubs and walked to the lobby. Standing behind the reinforced glass were two men who looked like they had been extruded from the same cold, gray mold. They wore dark, tailored suits that seemed impervious to the Colorado damp, and their expressions were as vacant and hard as river stones. Maya cracked the door just enough to speak. We aren't open for intake until 10. We aren't here to drop off an animal, Ms. Rowe, the taller one said. He didn't offer a name, only a laminated ID card that bore a stylized hawk logo and the words Sentinel Solutions. We're here to recover lost property. A Belgian Malinois or German Shepherd mix, tactical vest, marked with an identification tattoo on the inner ear. Property? Maya's voice was ice. In this building we have residents, not property. The second man stepped forward, his eyes scanning the lobby with a predatory efficiency. Let's not make this difficult. That animal is a high-value government asset currently under contract with Sentinel Solutions. He is a national security-sensitive recovery. You will bring him out now, or we will return with a federal seizure warrant that will make the rest of your professional life very complicated. I need to see a court order and a transfer of custody from the Department of Agriculture, Maya replied, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. And until a veterinarian clears him for transport, he stays here. He's emaciated and suffering from severe neurological distress. The taller man leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating threat. What you think you've seen or heard, Ms. Rowe, is a proprietary hallucination. You're playing with things that don't belong in a municipal dog pound. Keep the animal and you're not just looking at a lawsuit. You're looking at an obstruction charge that carries a 20-year ceiling. We'll be back in 2 hours. Have him ready." They turned in unison and vanished into a black SUV that sat idling in the lot like an idling shark. Maya leaned against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She hurried back to the medical bay, but as she passed the intake desk, her eyes caught a small silver glint tucked into the corner of the ceiling molding. It was a pinhole camera, its tiny lens glowing with a faint, malicious blue light. It hadn't been there yesterday. They weren't just coming back, they were already inside. "Marcus," she hissed, bursting into the exam room. The vet was hunched over a laptop, his face illuminated by a scrolling wall of green text. "I sent the chip's header code to an old classmate at DARPA," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. "He nearly hung up on me. He said Project Sentinel was a ghost story, a black-budget experiment into interspecies communication using neural link vocalization. If this dog is what I think he is, he's the only successful bridge between human thought and animal speech ever created. We have to document it," Maya said, a desperate plan forming. "If they take him, he disappears. If the world sees him, they can't kill him without a scandal." She grabbed her phone and hit record. Kaiser was awake now, his head propped up on a pillow. Maya leaned in, her voice shaking but clear. "Kaiser? Can you say it again? Tell them what you need." The dog looked at the lens. His throat worked, the synthetic mesh clicking under his skin. "Home," he rasped. The sound was clearer than before, a haunting, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "Please, home." Maya's intern Leo stood in the doorway, his own phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip. He was 19, a kid who lived his life in the digital ether. He looked at the dog, then at the terrified faces of his mentors. Without a word, he turned and vanished into the back hallway. By the time the black SUVs pulled back into the gravel lot 2 hours later, the world had already changed. Leo had uploaded the raw, unedited footage to 3 different social media platforms with the caption, "They made him talk and now they want to kill him. #WhoMadeKaiser." Maya looked at her phone. The video had been live for less than 3 hours. The view count was climbing so fast the digits were a blur. 100,000, 350,000, 500,000. It was trending globally. The hashtag was a wildfire. As the men in suits stepped out of their vehicles, they weren't looking at Maya. They were looking at their own phones, their composed masks finally beginning to crack. But as the taller man reached into his jacket, not for an ID this time but for something heavier, a low rhythmic thumping began to vibrate the windows, and the shadow of a news helicopter swept across the parking lot, followed by another and then a third. The secret was out, but as Maya looked at the red light on the security camera, she realized the signal wasn't coming from the news crews, it was coming from a secondary, unauthorized frequency that was currently bypassing the shelter's entire firewall. By sunset the world was screaming. The video of Kaiser had breached the digital dam, flooding the internet with a speed that left Maya breathless. What started as a local anomaly had transformed into a global obsession. By 5 o'clock the view count hit 3 million, by 6, it was 5. The #WhoMadeKaiser was no longer just a trend, it was a rallying cry. Outside the shelter's reinforced gates, the quiet Colorado Springs street had vanished, replaced by a chaotic sea of satellite vans, flashing emergency lights, and a growing crowd of protesters holding hand-painted signs that read "He has a voice and justice for Subject 07. Inside, the phone lines were jammed, a constant, shrill ringing that Maya finally silenced by pulling the cords from the walls. The air in the lobby felt charged, vibrating with the literal thunder of news helicopters circling overhead. Every few minutes, a fresh wave of reporters would hammer on the glass, their faces distorted by the glare of their own camera lights, shouting questions that Maya couldn't bring herself to answer. The black SUVs had returned, but they were no longer alone. This time, they were flanked by a white sedan carrying 3 men in charcoal gray suits clutching thick, leather-bound folders. These weren't the recovery thugs from that morning. These were the lawyers, the men who fought with paper instead of shadows. "Ms. Rowe," the lead attorney shouted through the gap in the door, holding up a document bearing a heavy federal seal. "This is an emergency injunction issued by the district court. You are in possession of restricted experimental technology. By holding this animal, you are in violation of Title 18 of the U.S. Code. If you do not open this door, the federal marshals behind us are authorized to use breaching equipment." Maya looked back at her staff. Leo, Marcus, and 2 brave volunteers stood in the hallway, their faces pale but set in grim lines. They didn't move. They formed a thin human line between the lobby and the medical bay where Kaiser lay. "The world is watching," Maya shouted back, her voice cracking but firm. She pointed toward the fence, where hundreds of people were filming the standoff on their phones. "If you break into an animal shelter to kidnap a dying dog on live television, there won't be enough lawyers in DC to save your reputation. He stays until he's medically stable." The standoff stretched into a tense, sweating hour. The lawyers huddled, their phones glued to their ears, glancing nervously at the growing crowd and the hovering news drones. The optics were a disaster. Public pressure was a physical weight, a collective roar that grew every time a camera caught a glimpse of Maya's defiant silhouette. Finally, with a sharp gesture of frustration, the lead attorney signaled his team. They retreated to the SUVs, though they didn't leave. They parked at the edge of the property, a silent, circling perimeter of predators waiting for the cameras to go dark. Maya collapsed into her desk chair, her head in her hands. She felt like she was trying to hold back the ocean with a plastic bucket. That was when her personal laptop chimed, a private, encrypted message notification that bypassed her filtered inbox. The sender was E. Santos. The message contained a single attached file, a high-resolution scan of a blueprint for a canine larynx, overlaid with circuit diagrams that matched the scars on Kaiser's throat. "My name is Dr. Elena Santos," the message began. "I was the lead researcher for Project Sentinel. I am the reason that dog can speak, and I am the reason he is dying. The neural implants in his spine are designed to degrade if they aren't serviced by their proprietary hardware. They didn't just make him talk, they built a kill switch into his very consciousness." Maya's breath hitched as she read the final lines, the text blurring before her eyes. "I am currently at Denver International Airport. I am coming to you, but you must understand, Kaiser is not the only one. There are 22 others who didn't survive the voice, and Sentinel Solutions will not stop until he is silenced forever. They cannot let a witness with a human tongue remain in the world." As Maya stared at the screen, a new notification popped up on the shelter's internal security feed. The unauthorized frequency she had noticed earlier wasn't just watching them anymore. It was sending a command. Deep in the medical bay, Kaiser's monitors began to flatline as the red light beneath his skin turned a solid, angry purple, and the massive dog's body began to arch in a seizure that no medication could stop. The storm had finally tapered to a freezing mist by the time a nondescript rental car drifted through the gauntlet of news vans and parked near the shelter's side entrance. A woman stepped out, pulling a trench coat tight against the mountain chill. She didn't look like a shadow operative or a corporate spy. She looked like a woman haunted by a ghost only she could see. When Maya opened the door, she saw the dark circles under Dr. Elena Santos's eyes that darted nervously toward the black SUVs still idling at the edge of the property. Inside the cramped break room, the air was heavy with the smell of stale coffee and clinical disinfectant. Marcus stood guard at the door, his arms crossed, while Maya sat opposite the woman who had helped build the nightmare currently seizing on their medical table. Elena's hands shook as she laid a series of encrypted drives on the table. "I didn't think any of them were left," Elena began, her voice a hollow rasp. "Subject 7, Kaiser, was the only one who didn't reject the final interface. We called it the linguistic bridge. The goal wasn't just to make them mimic sounds, it was to give the military a weapon that could think, report, and negotiate." She looked at Maya, her expression pleading for a fragment of understanding. "Imagine a K9 that can describe the layout of a bunker while inside it. A dog that can tell a hostage taker in a human voice that his perimeter is breached. Or worse, a predator that speaks to its targets in the dark." It was psychological warfare as much as it was tactical. But the cost was everything. Elena tapped a file on her laptop, revealing a gallery of X-rays that looked more like schematics for a computer than a living skeleton. "The voice isn't a gift. It's a constant friction. The mesh in the throat causes chronic inflammation. The neural links in the spine create a sensory overload that feels like white-hot needles under the skin. Out of 23 dogs, 22 were retired. That's the word they used for euthanasia, because the pain turned them suicidal or catatonic. I told the board it was inhumane. I begged them to stop. They told me it was necessary for the safety of our soldiers." She choked back a sob, the professional veneer finally cracking. "I left 8 months ago because I couldn't watch another one die. But I was a coward. I took my severance, signed the non-disclosure agreements, and tried to forget the sound of their voices. I never reported it. I let them keep the data." A sudden violent crash erupted from the medical bay. Maya and Elena bolted from their chairs, rushing to the observation window. Kaiser was awake, But he wasn't the pleading, broken animal from the night before. He had managed to roll off the table, his massive paws skidding on the linoleum. When his eyes landed on Elena through the glass, his entire posture changed. His hackles rose into a jagged ridge, and a sound erupted from him that made the glass vibrate, not a bark but a scream of pure, articulate fury. "No!" Kaiser shouted, the word echoing with a metallic, tortured resonance. "No. Stay. No." He lunged at the glass, his weight cracking the reinforced pane. He wasn't just aggressive, he was terrified, reacting to Elena like a victim seeing their tormentor in a dark alley. Elena collapsed against the wall, tears streaming down her face as she watched the dog struggle to stay upright. "He remembers," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He remembers the white rooms. He remembers the needles. He remembers that I was the one who gave him the voice he hates." Kaiser slumped back to the floor, his breathing coming in ragged, whistling gasps, his eyes never leaving Elena's. The room fell into a deafening silence, broken only by the dog's soft, repetitive whimpering of the word, "no." Elena wiped her eyes, a sudden, sharp clarity hardening her features. She looked at the laptop, then at the news crews visible through the front windows. "They're going to kill him to keep this quiet," she said, her voice now cold and certain. "And they'll kill anyone who helps him. But I'm done running. I'm going to give him back his life, or I'm going to make sure the world watches as they try to take it." She turned to Maya, her jaw set. "Call the news stations. All of them. Tell them I'm ready to testify. But we have to move now because I just saw something on the perimeter feed that wasn't there 5 minutes ago, and it means the lawyers have finally stepped aside for the cleaners." The air inside the shelter felt brittle, as if the tension of the looming standoff outside had crystallized every breath. While the world screamed for answers on the other side of the glass, the reality inside the medical bay was quiet, intimate, and profoundly broken. Kaiser had stabilized, but his spirit remained a fractured mirror, reflecting back the different roles he had been forced to play. Maya noticed the patterns first. When she was alone with him, Kaiser's massive body would lose some of its rigidity. He would rest his heavy head on his paws, his amber eyes following her every movement with a protective, almost reverent stillness. But the moment Leo or Marcus entered wearing their industrial gray work smocks, the closest thing the shelter had to a uniform, Kaiser would snap into a terrifying, statue-like posture. His ears would pin back, and he would offer a hollow, joyless stare, waiting for a command that his body was prepared to follow even if his mind screamed in protest. "He's not just traumatized, Maya," Marcus noted, observing from the doorway as Kaiser instinctively sat at attention when a police siren wailed in the distance. "He's hardwired. His conditioning is deep-seated, overriding his own autonomy." The true depth of that conditioning revealed itself later that afternoon. Maya was cleaning a nearby kennel when she muttered a stern Platz, a German command she'd picked up from years of working with working breeds. The effect was instantaneous and chilling. Kaiser didn't just lie down. He dropped as if he'd been shot, his chin hitting the concrete with a dull thud, his eyes wide and leaking a primal sort of terror. He remained there, unmoving even as he began to tremble. "Kaiser, no." "It's okay," Maya cried, rushing to him. "You didn't move." He stayed frozen in the down position, a prisoner to a language that had been used to weaponize his very soul. "He can't help it," Elena said softly, leaning against the doorframe, her eyes red-rimmed. The neural links reinforced the commands with dopamine and pain. If he obeys, the noise in his head stops. If he resists, the implants spike his nervous system. It's not loyalty, Maya. It's a physiological trap. To him, obedience is the only way to make the hurting stop. Over the next few hours, Maya began a new kind of rehabilitation. She didn't want Kaiser to obey, she wanted him to choose. She sat on the floor, far enough away to give him space, and began a series of gentle sessions. She would give a soft command, "Sit," and then immediately follow it with, "You don't have to, Kaiser. You can stay." The struggle was visible. Kaiser's muscles would twitch, his brain firing signals that his body felt compelled to honor, while his eyes searched Maya's for the punishment he expected to follow his defiance. It was a grueling tug-of-war between years of brutal programming and a newfound spark of trust. Then it happened. Maya whispered, "Kaiser, come," and then held up a hand. "Or stay. It's your choice." Kaiser's front leg shifted. He let out a low, frustrated huff. He looked at the door, the path to the commanders, and then back at Maya. Slowly, deliberately, he let his weight shift onto his hip and lowered his head to the floor. He hadn't moved. He had stayed. He had refused. "Good boy," Maya whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Good boy. But the victory was tempered by the cost. Every time Kaiser tried to communicate, the synthetic mesh in his throat vibrated with a sickening, metallic click. Elena explained that the implants were never perfected. The physical act of speaking was like dragging a blade across his vocal cords. Then why does he do it? Maya asked, watching Kaiser struggle to form a sound. If it hurts that much, why not just be a dog again? Because for Subject 7, communication was the only thing that kept him from being retired, Elena replied grimly. In the lab, if he didn't vocalize his status, they increased the voltage. He speaks because he's been trained to believe that silence is a death sentence. Late that night, after Marcus and Elena had fallen into a fitful sleep in the break room, Maya stayed with Kaiser. The shelter was dark, lit only by the soft glow of the emergency exit signs. She felt a cold wetness on her hand and looked down. Kaiser had crawled across the floor, dragging his heavy, scarred body until he was within reach. He didn't bark. He didn't perform. He looked up at her, and in a voice so soft it was barely a breath, a sound that cost him a visible wince of pain, he spoke a single word. Stay. It wasn't a command. It was a request, the first one he had ever made in his life. Maya felt a tear slip down her cheek as she slid to the floor and pulled his massive head into her lap. I'm not going anywhere, Kaiser, she whispered. I'm right here. They sat in the silence of the night, a woman and a creature who had been turned into a ghost, waiting for the morning they both knew would bring fire. But as Maya stroked his ears, she felt a strange vibration coming from Kaiser's tactical vest. Not a growl, but a rhythmic electronic pulse that was accelerating in time with a new, blinking light on the black SUV parked just outside the fence. The fragile peace of the night shattered at 4 a.m., not with a bang, but with the rhythmic, wet thud of Kaiser's skull hitting the exam table. Maya, who had been dozing with her hand on his flank, bolted upright as the massive German shepherd began to thrash. It wasn't a standard convulsion. His limbs moved in jagged, robotic spasms, and his jaw snapped rhythmically as if an invisible wire was being yanked inside his throat. Marcus, Elena. Maya screamed, bracing her weight against Kaiser's shoulders to keep him from throwing himself off the table. Elena burst into the room, her face pale. She grabbed a tablet, her fingers flying over a diagnostic interface. The neural links are misfiring, she shouted over the sound of Kaiser's labored, clicking breaths. The inflammation has reached his brain stem. He's developing acute cerebral edema, brain swelling. If we don't get the primary processor out of his C1 vertebra, his own nervous system will cook his brain in less than 3 hours. Marcus rushed in, clutching a bottle of diazepam, but his hands were shaking. I'm a shelter vet, Elena. I can patch up a gunshot wound or perform a spay, but I can't do neurosurgery on a modified cyborg canine interface. I don't even have the right retractors. I know someone who can, Elena said, her voice tight. She was already dialing a number. Dr. Ravi Patel. He was the lead neurosurgeon who consulted on the initial project before he was forced out for ethical inconsistencies. He's in Denver. If he starts driving now, he can make it. The next hour was a blur of frantic coordination and escalating dread. Dr. Patel had answered on the third ring, his voice weary but sharp. He agreed to come, but his list of requirements was impossible. Specialized cautery tools, a portable MRI, and a sterile field that a municipal shelter simply couldn't provide. As they scrambled to prep the room, the world outside decided it had waited long enough. The pre-dawn gloom was incinerated by a sudden explosion of light, stadium-grade floodlights mounted on the black SUVs. The front gate alarm began its rhythmic howl again, but this time, it was accompanied by the heavy, metallic clatter of federal marshals taking positions. Maya ran to the lobby. Through the glass, she saw the lead Sentinel Solutions attorney, but he was flanked by 4 men in tactical vests labeled U.S. Marshal. One held a heavy ram, another held a stack of papers. Open the door, Ms. Rowe, the lead marshal shouted through a megaphone, his voice echoing off the nearby hills. We have a federal seizure order under the National Security Act. This facility is now a restricted zone. You have 60 seconds to comply before we breach. Behind the marshals, the media circus had reached a fever pitch. Dozens of reporters had breached the outer perimeter, their live streams broadcasting the standoff to millions of people who were waking up to the news of a talking dog being hunted by the state. He's in the middle of a medical crisis. Maya screamed back, her face pressed to the glass. If you move him now, you're killing him. That is no longer your concern, the attorney shouted. Move. Maya turned to see Marcus and Elena wheeling Kaiser toward the lobby on a gurney, desperate to find a more secure room. Just as they reached the center of the room, Kaiser's body arched in a violent, final seizure. His tactical vest let out a high-pitched electronic whine, and his eyes rolled back in his head. The front door exploded inward. The marshals swarmed in, their boots thundering on the linoleum, their weapons drawn but lowered. The lead marshal reached for the gurney, but he stopped dead when Kaiser's mouth opened. The dog wasn't thrashing anymore. He was rigid, his gaze locking onto Maya with a lucidity that was more haunting than the seizure itself. Outside, dozens of phone cameras were pressed against the windows, capturing every second of the confrontation. "Home," Kaiser rasped. The word didn't come from his throat. It seemed to vibrate from his entire chest, clear and agonizingly human. "What, home? Maya." The room went silent. Even the marshals recoiled, the sheer wrongness, and the sheer humanity, of the sound stripping away their professional stoicism. On the other side of the glass, the crowd erupted. The video was already live. Within seconds, the hashtag Let Kaiser Stay Home hit the top of the global charts. The lead marshal looked at the dog, then at the attorney, then at the sea of cameras filming his every move. His radio chirped. "Stand down," a voice crackled through the comms. "A federal judge just issued an emergency stay. The public outcry is too high. Do not touch the asset until further notice." The tension in the room snapped like a violin string. As the marshals began to retreat to the perimeter, a silver sedan screeched into the lot, and a man carrying a heavy black medical case vaulted over the fence. "I'm Patel," he shouted, bursting through the shattered door. "Get him back on the table. Now." As the team rushed Kaiser back into surgery, Maya stood in the wreckage of her lobby, watching the surgeons work through the observation glass. But as Dr. Patel made the first incision into Kaiser's neck, his face went deathly pale, and he looked up at Elena with an expression of pure terror. "Elena," he whispered, pointing to a secondary, hidden implant that wasn't on the original schematics. "What the hell is this? This isn't a neural link. It's a remote detonation failsafe." The sterile, marble-clad halls of the Dirksen Senate office building were a world away from the mud and rain of Colorado, yet the ghost of Project Sentinel haunted every corridor. The congressional hearing, fast-tracked by a tidal wave of public fury, had become a televised trial for the soul of the country's defense contractors. Maya sat in the front row of the gallery, her hand gripping the wooden bench so hard her knuckles were white. Behind her, the room was packed with journalists, activists, and citizens, all held in a breathless, suffocating silence. Dr. Elena Santos walked to the witness stand with the posture of someone approaching a gallows. She wore a dark suit, her face gaunt but her eyes burning with a hard, final clarity. When she raised her right hand to be sworn in, the cameras of every major news network in the world flashed in a blinding strobe. The objective of Project Sentinel was never just communication. Elena's voice rang out, steady despite the tremor in her hands. It was total control. "We used a black-budget pipeline to divert millions in unauthorized military funds to bypass the Animal Welfare Act. We didn't just train these animals, we dismantled them." As she spoke, she began to display the evidence. Internal memos, falsified veterinary reports, and the haunting retirement logs. 23 dogs were subjected to the full vocal modification and Neuralink procedure. Only 3 survived the initial 6 months. The others... She paused, her voice breaking for the first time. The others were euthanized when the pain made them unmanageable for the handlers. Kaiser, Subject 7, was the only one who maintained linguistic coherence despite the neurological damage. He was the miracle they wanted to turn into a weapon. The room erupted when Dr. Ravi Patel took the stand. He held up a high-resolution scan of the remote detonation failsafe he had successfully removed from Kaiser's spine. This device served no medical or tactical purpose, Patel testified, his voice dripping with professional disdain. It was a literal kill switch. Sentinel Solutions was so afraid of their properties speaking out that they were prepared to execute a living creature remotely to protect their stock price. Outside the Capitol, the scene was even more volatile. Thousands had gathered at the headquarters of Sentinel Solutions, their signs illuminated by the glow of giant screens broadcasting the testimony. The company's executives, flanked by a phalanx of high-priced lawyers, refused to testify, repeatedly citing classified national security interest. But the wall of secrecy was crumbling. Inspired by Elena's courage, 2 more whistleblowers, a former kennel technician and a logistics officer, had come forward to the media, revealing the locations of clandestine holding facilities where the other survivors were being kept. 2,000 miles away, in the quiet recovery ward of Maya's sanctuary, Kaiser watched the television. His head was wrapped in soft bandages, and the aggressive twitching in his limbs had finally ceased. The surgery had been a success, but the victory was bitter. Dr. Patel had been honest. The damage to Kaiser's nerves was permanent. He would always walk with a slight tremor, and the act of vocalizing, the very thing that had saved him, would always cause a sharp, stinging friction in his reconstructed throat. He was a creature between worlds, stabilized but forever altered. Elena arrived at the shelter late that night, her testimony finished and her career effectively over. She walked into Kaiser's ward, stopping several feet away. She didn't expect him to welcome her. She expected the no that had haunted her dreams. "I'm sorry, Kaiser," she whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion. "I should have stopped them at subject 1. I should have been your voice before you were forced to find your own." Kaiser looked at her. The amber of his eyes seemed deeper now, less clouded by the fog of his implants. He stood up, his legs shaking slightly, and took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Elena held her breath, prepared for him to snarl. Instead, he leaned his massive weight against her knees. He opened his mouth, the synthetic mesh clicking softly, and forced a sound through the pain. "Understand." It was a word of grace, a bridge built over a chasm of suffering. Elena collapsed to her knees, burying her face in his thick fur and sobbing into his neck. Kaiser didn't pull away. He rested his heavy chin on her shoulder, allowing the woman who had helped break him to be the first person he truly forgave. But as the two of them held on to each other in the moonlight, a notification on Maya's tablet showed a new development in the hearing. The Senate committee had just moved to a closed-door session, and a leaked memo suggested that while Sentinel Solutions was being dismantled, the technology behind Project Sentinel had already been sold to a third party, one that didn't answer to any government. The storm that had defined Kaiser's arrival felt like a lifetime ago. In the wake of the congressional hearings and the public unmasking of Project Sentinel, the world had moved on to new scandals, but for the Mountain View shelter, the real work had only just begun. The investigation concluded with the official termination of the program, and as the executives of Sentinel Solutions swapped their tailored suits for orange jumpsuits, Maya fought a final, grueling legal battle. The result was a first-of-its-kind federal exemption. Kaiser would not be processed or returned to a government kennel. He was granted permanent residency under Maya's care, a living symbol of a debt that could never fully be repaid. With the influx of donations from a world moved by the video of a dog asking for a home, Maya had transformed the back acreage of the property into a specialized sanctuary. It was 2 acres of Colorado heaven, sloping hills of tall grass, clusters of fragrant lodgepole pines, and a recirculating stream that provided a constant, soothing soundtrack. A custom-built indoor-outdoor facility stood at the center, designed with ramps and soft flooring to accommodate the neurological tremors that still occasionally ghosted through Kaiser's limbs. The most important addition, however, wasn't the grass or the water. It was the 3 shadows that followed Kaiser into the sunlight on a crisp Tuesday morning. They were the other survivors of the project, a Belgian Malinois and 2 other shepherds, who had been pulled from the brink of retirement thanks to Elena's testimony. They didn't speak as Kaiser did. Their modifications had been less complete, their voices silenced by trauma or faulty hardware. But they looked to Kaiser as their alpha, their subject 7, the one who had led them out of the dark. For the first week, Kaiser was a ghost in his own paradise. He explored the perimeter with a tactical caution, his ears constantly swiveling toward the sound of distant engines. He tested the boundaries, often standing at the gate for hours looking at the open road. He had the freedom to leave, the gate left unlatched during the day to prove he wasn't a prisoner, yet every evening as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, he would trot back to his bed in the clinic, seeking the comfort of the walls that had first shielded him. By the second week, a new rhythm took hold. Maya began to find Kaiser waiting for her at the gate every morning at 6 a.m. She would bring a thermos of coffee, and they would sit together in the dewy grass. She didn't give him commands. She didn't ask him to perform. She simply spoke to him about the mundane details of her day, treating him with the quiet dignity of an old friend. 3 weeks into his new life, the morning arrived in a spectacular wash of gold. The sunrise bled through the pines, casting long amber shadows across the sanctuary. Maya stood by the cedar fence, watching the other 3 dogs chase each other through the tall grass. Kaiser approached her, his gait more fluid than she had ever seen it. He stopped a few inches away, his amber eyes clear, peaceful, and startlingly present. Maya saw his throat work. She saw the familiar wince, the slight tension in his jaw that reminded her that every syllable still cost him a price in pain. She went to reach for him, to tell him he didn't have to try, but the look in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't a reflex. It wasn't a response to a command. "Thank you," Kaiser said. The words were soft, deliberate, and entirely his own. They weren't the pleas of a beggar or the home of a victim. It was a gift, freely offered from a soul that had finally reclaimed its own territory. Maya felt the hot sting of tears as she leaned over the fence, pressing her forehead against his. "You don't have to thank me, Kaiser," she whispered into his fur. "You deserved this from the moment you were born. You're free." Kaiser let out a long, contented sigh, pressing his weight against the wood, letting her hand rest on the crown of his head. He turned back toward the meadow, watching his unit play in the golden light. The voice they had given him was meant to be a weapon of war, a tool for deception and death. Instead, it had become the instrument of his liberation, the only way the world could finally hear the truth. As the sun rose higher, Kaiser lay down in the grass, a king in a kingdom of his own choosing. He was at peace, finally home and finally free. But as Maya turned back toward the shelter office, she saw a black, nondescript drone hovering silently at the very edge of the property line, its lens zoomed in on Kaiser's throat. A single red light on its undercarriage blinked once, a signal sent to a recipient far beyond the reach of any congressional hearing. Kaiser had to endure a nightmare just to find the words to ask for help. He shouldn't have to scream for us to listen. Every like on this video ensures his story reaches one more person who needs to hear it. Every comment below is a promise that we won't let these shadows hide the truth again. And by subscribing, you're joining a front line that protects animals like Kaiser from being forgotten. Don't let his voice go silent again. Show him you're listening.